So in Humankind, Morton develops this analogy to understand, or to try to explain rather, what correlationism is. So he talks about a music mixing board and two faders, a fader for the correlator and a fader for the correlatee. And I wanted to try to diagram this a bit. So let this dot here represent the transcendental ego or subject, and this circle will represent the limits of this transcendental ego's phenomenological experience. So in Morton's terms, we'll refer to this as the sensory screen. And all this poor ego can do is project its ideas and wishes and desires onto this sensory screen, and is sort of trapped within these phenomenological limits of its own experience. We could also refer to this, at the inside of this circle, as society, and the ego exists within this matrix of social construction. Now, many postmodernists will also refer to the importance of the other. And, Kant also talked about things in themselves, right, that exists outside of or beyond the sensory screen of the ego. And this other, these things in themselves, they somehow can break into this screen of projection, this matrix of social construction, through what we can call introjection. And in the normal, this is what this whole scheme is, what Morton is referring to as correlationism. Because even whilst there are thinkers that would accept the existence of this other, and indeed Kant, who accepted the existence of things in themselves, there's still this limitation placed on what we can say about this realm. Hegel tried to put the whole thing within the subject, and maybe that's what these dotted lines represent. So this is really strong correlationism. But the point here is that within this correlational setup, the other is wholly other. The other is so different that it's incommensurable with anything that the ego can know or understand. So even when this introjection happens, the ego always translates the other into its own terms. And, Morton will talk about the severing that occurred, he says, during the agricultural revolution, and that this trauma of the severing continues to repeat itself even in our own day and age, which makes the human being and human society feel totally cut off from the non-human natural world. And Morton's way beyond this setup is not to deny that a gap exists between how the world appears and what the world essentially is in itself, but rather to democratize or generalize this gap, to remove the anthropocentric copyright on the gap, as Morton puts it, so that rather than a scenario like this, with a solid sensory screen that can only be punctured radically by the incommensurable otherness of things in themselves, we would have a setup where actually, as Morton suggests, our worlds are perforated. They're not complete in and of themselves. So this sensory screen actually has holes in it, and the worlds of others are also perforated, and these worlds are constantly leaking into and out of one another. So it's not that the sensory screen isn't there, it's not that the ego isn't projecting, but the screen has holes in it, and we're all inextricably bound up. Our fragile worlds are constantly overlapping with one another, bumping into one another, and some of them overlap more than others, but the point is we aren't hermetically sealed within our own transcendental limits, and that these dots, which could represent agents or actors, they're not just human. All creatures have this gap between their own interiority and the way they appear to others. so their own inner essence and the way that they appear to others. So Morton's way beyond correlationism is by accepting that the transcendental gap that Kant thought only existed in the human being, that gap between the subject and everything else in the universe, is in fact present in all beings, right? So this is the release of the anthropocentric copyright.